Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 1031 Fire Sorrow's Shock and Universal Big Daddy. Shangguan Bingshui looked at him extremely confused. She had no idea why on earth or for what reason Bai Zemin would bring Feng Tianwu's name out of nowhere, but she assumed that he was talking to Lilith, and the annoying woman for some reason did not want to show herself in front of her. Fire Sorrow was also confused at the mention of an unfamiliar name, Feng Tianwu. Who is that? Bai Zemin's eyes lit up, and instead of answering immediately he turned to look at Shangguan Bingshui. Bingshui, I'm sorry, but something came up. Can you take care of business here? Why yes, of course. Shangguan Bingshui was a bit overwhelmed by the sudden change of things, but still nodded immediately, and with ease. Besides, as much as the idea didn't please her too much, it was true that Bai Zemin had the right to spend some time alone with the one he loved after not seeing her for about half a year, and in any case, Shangguan Bingshui knew deep in her heart that she had neither the right nor the qualifications to object. At the end of the day, she was his best friend. A few minutes later, Shangguan Bingshui watched as Bai Zemin rode on Little Snow's back and dashed away until he soon disappeared beyond the skyline into the distance. To her, the word friendship was very precious, and that was precisely why she had few whom she truly considered heartfelt friends. Shangguan Bingshui had thought that being friends with Bai Zemin was already awesome, considering that they both started their relationship on the wrong foot and both had poor opinions of the other. Besides, as far as she was concerned, friendship was even more important than her life on many occasions, so the thought of being enough or not never crossed her mind. Until now, that is. For the first time, Shangguan Bingshui felt that the word friendship and friends were not pleasant at all, and remembering the derisive look Lilith gave her months ago when she told her that she would simply be his good friend for life did nothing but add fuel to the flames. Several minutes later, Shangguan Bingshui slowly unclenched the fists she had inadvertently clenched, before letting out a deep sigh. I was so easy to control myself in the past, but ever since I started evolving, I keep losing it when it comes to that person. She shook her head before her eyes turned ice cold. Soon, the cold-blooded queen they all knew returned and began to nimbly give order after order. Fire Sorrow, it's okay if you show yourself before Little Snow. Actually, she's known about Lilith for a long time anyway. In the sky and directly flying towards Inner Mongolia, Bai Zemin stroked the soft white fur of his mount as he said those words. Fire Sorrow looked at the big white dog with a weird expression before revealing herself, and when Little Snow looked at her with her bright blue eyes for a moment before ignoring her, Fire Sorrow's expression became even more interesting. This dog of yours is quite mysterious. Mysterious? Bai Zemin and Lilith were both confused. What could be mysterious about a non-breed dog that was picked up from the streets anyway? Leaving aside why she doesn't seem to care about higher existences, what's the deal with this absurdly high agility? Fire Sorrow was becoming more and more perplexed by every second that passed on Earth. Were they all irregular monsters, or what? Oh, Little Snow is very fast. Bai Zemin nodded calmly and pointed out, she was always pretty fast, even before she evolved. Probably her class has something to do with speed or wind? She can even walk and run through the sky with all freedom and even more agile than a bird. By the way, Zemin. Lilith interrupted, do you know why Little Snow is still not able to speak? I tried before, but she just held in response. No, I'm afraid I don't. Bai Zemin sighed as he shook his head. Mutant beasts were supposed to be able to gain human form upon entering the Third Order, but Little Snow simply can't do that even though she's clearly as intelligent as a normal adult person. Fire Sorrow, do you have any idea? Lilith asked the most experienced person among them, but even Fire Sorrow was at a loss on this matter. It's the first time I've seen something like this. She shook her head. After a few seconds of silence, Bai Zemin simply dismissed the matter and instead focused on what really mattered to him at the moment, putting aside the whole Little Snow thing for now. Fire Sorrow, could you tell me if that fire-like energy you told me about earlier is coming from a human? A human? Good joke. Fire Sorrow looked at Bai Zemin with a smile, but her smile slowly receded as she saw his serious expression. You're asking for real? Seeing him nod, Fire Sorrow couldn't help but chuckle as she shook her head. She focused her eyes straight ahead and while flapping her wings, calmly said faintly, I don't know why you're asking something like that, but it's not possible. It's not possible for the simple fact that a human can't withstand that kind of temperature, Even you would end up being turned into ashes in a matter of 30 or 40 minutes, so it's hard for me to imagine a human or any other lower existence, regardless of race, being the cause or source of this fire-like energy. After a moment of silence, she continued, also, the power of this flame is strange. Somehow it feels like my flame, but at the same time different, and it's not possible for a lower existence to have a flame this strong anyway. After several seconds of silence and without receiving any kind of response, Fire Sorrow turned to look at Xietain and Lilith. She was noticeably surprised to find that his expression was not particularly pleasant. "What's wrong?" "It's nothing," Xietain replied calmly. Seeing that he refused to say anything and Fire Sorrow was frowning worriedly, Lilith couldn't help but sigh. She didn't want to leave the woman who had barely found a small trace of hope of reuniting with the one she had loved all her life for millions of years, so after a brief hesitation, she explained the situation to let the powerful 7th Order mage to understand what her mistake was. "Fire Sorrow, this little scoundrel here knows that the term lower existence is rarely used by us in a dismissive way, but he doesn't like those two words too much. So you might want to use it less around." "Is that right?" Fire Sorrow looked at Xietain waiting for confirmation. "I do know that Lilith has no bad intentions when she refers to people like me using the words lower existence, and I believe that you also have no intentions of mocking or anything like that." Xietain glanced sideways at her and saw Fire Sorrow hurriedly shaking her head, so he continued, "But, can you really say that all of you higher existences are the same? I'm pretty sure most of you are as stupidly arrogant as blind horses, forgetting that you were once one of these lower existences you make so much fun of." Fire Sorrow frowned slightly and muttered under her breath, "That's..." Thinking of Crow and Valiant, as well as many members of the demonic army, Fire Sorrow suddenly found herself unable to refute the words of the young man flying beside her. Crow disdained everything below the 5th Order, and although Valiant was not so extreme, she had once said that she did not consider those in the 4th Order and below to be true soul evolvers. "You see?" Xietain shook his head and said coldly, "You all are too full of yourselves, and treat us like worthless trash. But it's okay, this daddy will make the proud higher existences learn why roses are red someday in the future to come." "This daddy?" Fire Sorrow nearly choked, and her attention immediately turned to something else completely different. "Don't tell me you also refer to yourself as this daddy." Xietain frowned and said seemingly in disgust, "Who the hell dares to use my line? There can only be one daddy in this universe, and I am the universal Big Daddy." Fire Sorrow's eyes went wide, and as she flew in a straight line, she looked at him in shock. "Ha ha ha ha." Lilith couldn't help but laugh to tears looking at Fire Sorrow's open mouth and incredulous expression. Xietain, who uses the words "this daddy" to refer to himself occasionally, is none other than the demon lord, the devil, Satan, Lucifer. "Lucifer?" Xietain snorted and said in an authoritative voice, "Well, when you see him again just tell him not to do it again, or else we will have serious problems." Fire Sorrow almost fell out of the sky, and Lilith literally laughed until her eyes began to tear up. After getting over the initial shock and disbelief, Fire Sorrow couldn't stop the corner of her lips from turning upward and her mouth quivered as she tried to contain the urge to laugh just like Lilith. She now understood a little more the reason why one of the two women who were considered the most beautiful in the universe, the cold and proud Lilith, had actually changed so much in the short span of a year. "This little boy sure is interesting." Fire Sorrow chuckled and shook her head to herself. Approximately 17 hours later, Xietain arrived at his faction's main base in Inner Mongolia, and the first thing he did was let Callie and Shirlin leave the Collector's Pocket World. Callie especially needed to return to the outside world as she was staying too much in the Pocket World by her own request. And although Xietain agreed as that was the safest place for her, it wasn't good for her mental health to be alone for so long. After dropping the two girls off at the base, Xietain mounted on Little Snow's back again and headed for an area located over 100 kilometers distant, but before arriving, he was forced to leave the big white dog behind, despite the cute mount's reluctance. When Xietain arrived at the subway chamber, he noticed that the thick ice walls that were built by Shangguan Bingshui using more than 30.000 mana points in total after several days of effort were almost completely melted. Lilith looked at Feng Tianwu naked on the ground and was greatly surprised when she found out that this girl who had caused Xietain great trauma in the past actually no longer looked human. What the hell happened to her? Feng Tianwu's skin at this point was so red that it looked as if someone had dumped several buckets of blood on her, and from the frown on her face, it was more than clear that she was experiencing an overwhelming deal of pain. As Baizemin whispered in an increasingly panting voice to Lilith about the events that occurred not long after she left, Fire Sorrow approached Feng Tianwu, and her expression did not stop becoming more and more incredulous with every step she moved ahead. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 1032 Feng Tianwu's One and Only Lifeline. When Fire Sorrow got close enough to Feng Tianwu to be able to see even the smallest of details on her body, she stopped dead in her tracks. The shocked expression on her face grew more and more as it was hard for her to believe or accept what she was feeling. What is this all about? Baizemin and Lilith heard Fire Sorrow's small whisper amidst the constant roar, caused by the crimson flames that covered the entirety of the ice chamber. But when he wanted to open his mouth to ask what was going on, he stopped immediately after realizing that he needed to focus on protecting himself with the power of the endless blue lotus flame if he didn't want to get damaged. In fact, Baizemin had his time counted down here. Minutes at most before he had to leave, and for every minute that passed for Feng Tianwu, the time Baizemin would have the next time he returned would be less and less until finally neither he nor anyone else would be able to get close to her. Such a thing would naturally mean the girl's death. Fire Sorrow, did you find out anything? Lilith frowned slightly and asked the question her beloved wanted to ask, but couldn't. Oh. Fire Sorrow let out a small sound before falling silent for a few seconds. Lilith and Baizemin watched her slender shoulders rise before dropping heavily in what seemed to be a large silent sigh, but when Fire Sorrow turned to look at them there was no hint in her expression. It's normal that you can't feel it since your element of preference is literally the opposite of this girl's. Fire Sorrow stayed standing next to Feng Tianwu as she quickly explained, actually, this girl's soul is being devoured by the flame that burns deep within her records. Flame? Lilith looked at Baizemin in confusion as if asking if he knew anything about it. Baizemin gritted his teeth and with great difficulty managed to blurt out a few words. She activated a domain before she fell into this state. He could immediately feel his body overheating, so he quickly held his breath and closed his mouth. Fire Sorrow nodded and without looking at the girl on the floor pointed out, that domain is probably the key to her being able to use that flame. Wait a minute. Lilith held out a hand and shook her head. What you mean is that this girl had that flame from the beginning, but she can't use it for some reason? That's how it is. Fire Sorrow shrugged her shoulders. Baizemin's head was in total confusion as he listened to Fire Sorrow's words. Sure, he knew that Feng Tianwu and apparently her entire family had some affinity towards the fire-type element. But, to have a flame from the beginning inside her? A flame that was there even before the arrival of the soul record and powerful enough to be sealed by a powerful domain which would consume her life if she activated it before she became powerful enough? Is she the reincarnation of some powerful soul evolver from the past? Lilith frowned slightly as she looked at the unconscious girl with a puzzled expression. Lilith wasn't the only one who was thinking such a thing. Baizemin was the same about it. In fact, it was the only plausible explanation. Baizemin could be the reincarnation of Sirius since the constellation of the Heavenly Wolf tried to contact him many years before the soul record came to Earth. And now there was this situation with Feng Tianwu. Hard to say. Fire Sorrow shook her head. But that might be the case. Lilith, even you and I are protecting ourselves against this flame in our own way. A few hours we might be fine standing here, but how about 1 or 2 whole days? Lilith frowned and said slowly, we'd probably have to take real cover or get out. And that's being caused by a third-order soul evolver. Fire Sorrow forced a smile and said, not knowing whether to laugh or cry, something really big is being orchestrated here on Earth, and apparently no one knows about it. There is no logical explanation at all for the existence of so many anomalies being born casually in the same era. Not even magic can do it at this point. Baizemin motioned for the 2 women to follow him and quickly headed for the exit of the ice room. After moving 1 or 2 kilometers away from the area, he finally let out the air he was holding back. That flame was really unbearable. Its power would seep out of his pores if Baizemin was not careful, and it would cause him great internal damage. Are you okay? Lilith and Fire Sorrow looked at each other before they both shook their heads. I'm fine. Baizemin sighed, his breathing slowly returning to normal as did the color of his face. After a moment of silence, he looked at Lilith and asked softly, Lilith, do you have any methods to help Feng Tianwu? Unfortunately. Lilith shook her head. Fire is the farthest element from me, just like Fire Sorrow said before. Besides, giving you that kind of information is not possible for me, Xietain. Xietain was surprised to hear Lilith's last words, but soon he understood what was the problem. Right. He nodded, discouraged. Higher existences could not mix too much with the fate that would immediately or greatly affect the life of lower existences. If Xietain did not find a way to solve Feng Tianwu's problem in less than a month, she would die, and that would be her fate. But if Lilith shared information with him that would potentially save her life, it would be no different than changing Feng Tianwu's fate of death in a fairly direct way. It was then that Xietain remembered something. He raised his head and looked at Fire Sorrow with eyes filled with hope, and when the powerful second-in-command of the demonic army saw his eyes, she felt her heart mellow greatly. Are you really sure you want to use the information I owe you in this way? Fire Sorrow asked softly. Even though she and Xietain had not made a soul contract, such a thing was not necessary. Fire Sorrow knew that the soul record was a sentient and intelligent being observing everything from somewhere, so there would definitely be no punishment to her if she shared information with him. The deal was question and answer in exchange for question and answer. It was fair. Yeah, I'm sure. Xietain nodded and said casually, she is my subordinate and got into this precarious situation while fighting on a battlefield to which I mobilized her. Regardless of her motives, my duty as leader is to respond to my subordinates when they move for me. At the very least, that was the kind of leader Xietain aspired to be. Fire Sorrow stared at Xietain for a few seconds before smiling. You and the past Sirius are very different. Xietain was startled by the sudden change in topic. In terms of personality, I mean. Fire Sorrow chuckled with her eyes closed. Sirius wasn't a bad leader, but as his tag name competes, he was more of a lone wolf. Sirius did not try his best to build a faction, but destroyed everything that opposed him, and his friends did the administration for him. On the other hand, I can see you worked hard to build all this. Well. Subconsciously, Xietain couldn't help but look at Lilith, and although he didn't say anything, this slight gesture was enough for Fire Sorrow to understand how things were. I see. So it was Lilith who got you out of the way of the lone wolf. Fire Sorrow looked at Lilith with complicated emotions, but in her eyes was a tinge of gratitude that was impossible to miss, but that neither of them understood much. Fire Sorrow turned her attention back to Xietain and said, this time in a serious voice, so, last opportunity. Think very carefully how you will phrase your question. I'm sure. Xietain nodded, but just as he opened his mouth to say something, Fire Sorrow interrupted him. Wait a moment, I suddenly got hungry. I beg your pardon? He looked at her with wide eyes before looking at Lilith, only to find his beloved just as surprised as he was. Fire Sorrow opened her right palm and the storage ring on her ring finger glowed faintly. The next instant, a bright red fruit that looked dangerous for some reason appeared in her hand. Then, something that left Xietain even more speechless happened. Oops. Fire Sorrow seemed to lose control over the peach-like fruit, and she watched as the fruit rolled across the ground until it stopped a step away from Xietain. As he looked at the fruit, he could see the ground catching fire and the earth sinking rapidly, as if the temperature of the peach-like fruit was too high to bear for the earth. Xietain looked at Fire Sorrow, and as he saw her silently ask if he could hand her the fruit, a glint of understanding shone in his eyes. Using annihilation of the falling sky in its gauntlet form, he bent down and picked up the fruit. Divine Daydream Pomegranate, consumable fruit rank 6, can store up to a total of 600.000.000.000 C degrees in fire-like energy. It grows in places whose temperature rises to over 10.000.000 and needs at least 2.000.000 years to be born. This fruit is fully ripe after burning for more than 4.6 million years. When consumed, it allows the user to store virtually any type of fire to be released once at any time. Xietain gasped and subconsciously threw the fruit at Fire Sorrow while taking half a step back. My God! That thing had enough power to blow up the entire Earth at least a few billion times, and if it wasn't because annihilation of the falling sky was indestructible, it would have turned into a pile of garbage not long after he grabbed the fruit with his hands. Fire Sorrow caught the fruit easily and said calmly, I remember it was about 4 million years ago when I picked this Divine Daydream Pomegranate from the sun orbiting the Earth. Suddenly I don't feel hungry anymore. Fire Sorrow, you. Lilith looked at her in shock and couldn't help but say in horror, are you out of your mind? Fire Sorrow raised her head to look up at the sky, and after several seconds without feeling anything strange she sighed, "Looks like it's okay." If Xietain didn't know what was going on, then he would be an idiot. "You." But he didn't know what to say. Fire Sorrow had risked a lot by doing what she had just done. She had literally taken more than half a step beyond the limits that her status as a higher existence imposed. And unlike Lilith, who after being punished would only fall, the result for Fire Sorrow would be death, as her true age definitely exceeded the limits of a lower existence. "So, did you think about your question, or did you change your mind?" Fire Sorrow asked with a smile while looking into his eyes, but Xietain could notice the slight trembling of her body. Xietan's eyes shone with extremely complicated emotions, and after a long time, he said in a serious voice, "I don't know what happened between you and the Heavenly Wolf Sirius. I also don't know whether I was him or not, and I also don't know the kind of person you were in the past. But, there is one thing I can say about you." "What's that?" Fire Sorrow asked with the same smile as before. "You are a great person. Regardless of whether you help me because of the possibility of my soul being serious or not, help is help. I will definitely pay you back in the future, I promise." Xietain bowed slightly. Without waiting to see Fire Sorrow's reaction, he turned, and as he walked away, Xietain used the commander's ring to link up with the ship. "This is Xietain to Sky Destroyer. Operators, get ready to set off. Leader? This is Lin Xiaoyan. We will have everything ready in 2 hours. If you will allow me, may I know where we are aiming?" Xietan's eyes glittered slightly, and he paused to look up at the night sky. Although he could not see his target, he knew it was there. Towards outer space. More specifically, towards our cherished Sunday. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 1033, Before Leaving for Outer Space. Towards outer space. More specifically, towards our cherished Sunday. That was all Xietain said before Fire Sorrow's next words served to dump an Olympic pool of cold water on his head. "Just out of curiosity, but how do you plan to withstand the temperature of the sun?" And that was how Xietain had to toughen his skin a bit to get back in touch with the Sky Destroyer operators and tell them to relax for a few days. 1 hour later, in the Collector's Pocket World. Xietain had entered the Pocket World accompanied only by Lilith and Fire Sorrow. He did not notify Sherlyn or Callie of this, as otherwise it was highly likely that the two girls would ask to enter with him, and Xietain did not want them to spend so much time detached from the outside world, thus losing all sense of time and distance. "I can't believe that a second-order soul evolver is holding something like this in his possession." Standing in front of the still unfinished house, Fire Sorrow surveyed the vast world that stretched as far as the eye could not see. Her eyes were wide open from the awe her fluctuating heart felt, and for almost a full minute she stood in that spot without moving after uttering the above words. After a whole minute, Lilith chuckled and said in amusement, "Pretty impressive, isn't it? Although this demigod-grade treasure doesn't grant direct combat capabilities or a colossal amount of support to its owner as far as the immediate battlefield is concerned, I think it's perfect for someone in the midst of growth and in need of time." Fire Sorrow turned to look at Xietain and said in surprise, "How did you get that watch of yours? This is simply unprecedented. A lower existence holding a demigod-grade treasure? Never. Unheard of in the history of the universe." Although the Collector's Pocket Watch did not seem to be a combat-focused treasure as Lilith had just pointed out earlier, its power was simply terrifying. It was among the most powerful treasures Fire Sorrow had ever seen in her entire life. It was born in a dungeon of a world that was evolving into its third stage. Xietain shrugged his shoulders. "Though I almost died to acquire it, and I was locked in an illusion that apparently lasted for 10,000 years. He had no need to hide those things from Fire Sorrow. Not only could she not hurt him, but Xietain doubted that she had even the slightest bad intention towards him. At the end of the day, Fire Sorrow had literally gambled with her life an hour ago, all for the sake of helping him. What? A demigod-grade treasure was born in a world that was entering its third stage? Fire Sorrow opened her eyes wide and looked at Lilith in shock. "And you treat it like it's a normal thing? No matter how you look at it, such a thing shouldn't happen no matter what. I stopped looking at things logically since I started spending too much time on Earth next to this little rascal." Lilith could feel the corner of her mouth quivering as she slowly said, "You get used to it. You get used to it so fast it's scary, and when you get back to normal you start to feel bored." In the past, Lilith saw the difference between levels as something very difficult to overcome and the difference between orders as something practically absolute that few chosen ones could handle. However, what about Earth's soul evolvers? Practically all of them could jump 10 to 20 levels, and there were not a few who could fight enemies that were one order completely above. Fire Sorrow looked at Xietain more and more astonished. There must definitely be something more strange in you that even you don't know about. Let me tell you that in all my life I have never seen anything like a demigod-grade treasure being born in a lower world. Even higher worlds very rarely bring one into existence, and we're talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of years. Xietain could say nothing at Fire Sorrow's words. He could only speak from his experience and what he had seen. As for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of years and higher worlds, he knew nothing about that. Besides, Fire Sorrow frowned and said softly, "You said you were locked in an illusion for 10 millennia? That seems to be the case." Xietain sighed. "Although I don't remember many things since the spirit of the collector's pocket watch sealed those memories in my soul such that I can only get them back little by little." Spirit of the collector's pocket watch. That meant that the treasure had the possibility to evolve to god grade. Fire Sorrow didn't know how to feel about it anymore, but she realized that at this rate she would really end up numb and get used to these anomalies as if they were normal things, just like Lilith told her before. "I guess that explains a bit of the reason why your aura seems to be from someone older than your real age." Fire Sorrow shook her head as she rubbed her temple. "You're very lucky, or maybe that's your fate, I don't know anymore." Fate? Xietain blinked, and for a brief moment, he felt that he had caught a hint of something when he heard this word, but by the time he realized this and tried to focus in order to catch it, it was too late, and like a fish slipping through wet hands it slipped away from him. So frustrating. "What is?" Lilith was confused to see him desperately ruffling his hair. "It's nothing, forget it." Xietain shook his head before lowering his arms helplessly. After a moment he took to regain his composure, he asked, "So, any ideas?" There was no need for him to specify further. The two women in front of him were extremely smart and knew what his biggest problem was at the moment. Although you don't need to step on the sun as such, getting close is something you won't be able to avoid if you want to find a divine daydream pomegranate. Fire Sorrow said in a serious voice, "The temperature of the sun must be around 20.000.000 degrees Celsius. If you get too close with your current stats and no protection you will turn into ashes." Xietain has a skill that allows him to repel 50% of anything that can be considered an attack, whether physical or magical. "I think we should start from this base." Lilith pointed with her arms folded. "A skill that allows you to repel half of any attack?" Fire Sorrow's voice trembled as a thought flashed in her head, bringing back very distant memories. She stared at Xietain, and with some hesitation said gently, You. Do you happen to have gravity manipulation?" She remembered that one of gravity manipulation's activations had something to do with reducing damage towards the user. That skill saved the Heavenly Wolf Sirius countless times in the past due to his eagerness to fight alone against numerous strong enemies. "I do." Xietain nodded as he looked into her eyes and slowly said, "Ruler of all matter, the second activation of gravity manipulation." Xietain and Lilith exchanged glances silently as they watched how Fire Sorrow's eyes lit up. I see." She nodded, and though she tried she couldn't help but smiled brightly as she stared at Xietain, practically in obsession. No, she wasn't specifically staring at Xietain. "Fire Sorrow, you." Lilith decided not to continue, but from the way she sighed and shook her head it was clear what her thoughts were regarding the current situation. But, just because Lilith was silent didn't mean that Xietain would. "Fire Sorrow, I think it's best if you remember that regardless of all coincidence I might not be the one you expect at all." Xietain said with a hint of sorry in his voice. "I don't want you to be disappointed later and suffer. I suffered for what I thought was love for some years. I can't imagine how much you have suffered for millions of years. That's why. Be careful." "Are you worried about me?" Fire Sorrow chuckled and reached out her hand gently towards his face, but stopped midway. She slowly lowered her palm and said with a small smile, "It's okay, nothing to worry about. I'm not known as Fire Sorrow for nothing after all." Xietain didn't know about the domain she was in control of, but the name Fire Sorrow didn't sound particularly encouraging to tell someone not to worry. Fire Sorrow didn't want the point to stagnate now, and she certainly didn't want to get any bad news or buckets of cold water on her head. She was finally being happy in her own way after so long and wanted to keep it that way for as long as life would let her. So, with gravity manipulation in Xieitain's possession, things are simpler. Fire Sorrow nodded with a slight smile before pointing out, "Now we just have to find a way for you to withstand high temperatures for at least 20 minutes. Before that, what about outer space? I can hold my breath for a long time, sure, but I don't know if my body can handle surviving the cosmic radiation." Xietain shrugged his shoulders. "Oh, you don't have to worry about that." Fire Sorrow winked at him and said with a smile, "Since you have blood manipulation in the fourth order, then you probably should have blood immortal radiance, is that right?" "Ah." Xietain subconsciously nodded slowly as he said in a low voice, "Right. Blood immortal radiance safeguards my deepest records from any damage or harmful modifications. That's why there is no need to worry about cosmic radiation." Lilith nodded calmly. She looked at Xietain, and after a small pause said with some frustration, "It really is annoying, but what that little brat said is true. She is the best partner you can hope to have right now in battle, and will stay that way until the distance of ranks between us disappears, Xietain." Of course, Xietain knew who Lilith was talking about. The one woman who for some reason she simply could not accept, but strangely used her somewhat peculiar method to push her to become better. "I think if Bing Shui and Callie join me, we can do something good." He nodded. "Callie?" "If I remember correctly, Callie is the name of the little girl in the wheelchair." Fire Sorrow's eyes darted back and forth between Xietain and Lilith as she said puzzled, "That little girl has some kind of amazing talent?" Callie was just a level 40 soul evolver, she couldn't move on her own, and she couldn't even see. However, Fire Sorrow had learned through hard knocks of surprise that it was not a good idea to underestimate any soul evolver on this planet, her home, a world she took for destroyed long ago. "Callie can draw very high-tier runes," Xietain explained calmly. "It was she who helped me with the earring I forged for Lilith." "Oh. Then I guess we can expect something good." Fire Sorrow nodded and subconsciously looked at the rank 6 earring in Lilith's ear. She really was curious about the earring and its full power, but she naturally wouldn't ask to see its records since after the previous 2 battles it became clear that the item was now one of Lilith's trump cards. She was also curious about this girl named Callie now that she knew about her ability to draw runes. Xietain observed her silently and apologized in his heart. He just didn't completely trust Fire Sorrow, and thus there was no way he would share Callie's ability to see souls and their colors with her. At the end of the day, Fire Sorrow was not Lilith, Fire Sorrow loved the heavenly wolf Sirius, not Xietain. Who knew if later in the future they would continue to be allies? Better safe than sorry. Xietain shook his head before getting down to business. And just like that, 6 days passed in the outside world, but for Xietain, Callie, Shangguan Bing Shui, Lilith, Fire Sorrow, and Bai Sherlin, 2 months passed in the collector's pocket world. During that time, Xietain took on the task of forging a full body armor, which took a total of 3 weeks to complete. Callie took 5 weeks to finish drawing runes on the forged armor, and Shangguan Bing Shui had finally invested over 180,000 mana points to support the upcoming operation. After the work was finished, the 3 of them received the same message at the same time. "You have successfully created full-body heavy armor Blood Surge Breastplate of Ice Magic. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse." Chapter 1034 A Guardian Who Cannot Be Defeated, Part 1. The creation of the new full-body armor was by no means a simple task, especially since at first Xietain hesitated over whether he should make a metal plate armor or a leather one. In this type of situation where he was looking for the greatest defense of all, the answer seemed to be obvious, but in reality, it was not as simple as it seemed. While it was true that a metal plate armor granted higher defense, metal was prone to overheat when exposed to high temperatures, and the place Xietain was targeting was not a particularly mild one. However, the reason he still decided to forge a metal plate armor over a leather one was very simple. While a leather armor certainly won't overheat like a metal one, I don't think there is a leather strong enough to handle the temperature of the sun. When Lilith said those words, any hesitation Xietain may have felt in his heart disappeared practically in an instant. Yes, the metal plate armor would definitely overheat and potentially melt once he got too close to the sun. However, the leather armor was better than this? No, of course not. Leather armor would catch fire immediately like a pile of papers thrown on a burning torch. Before getting to work, Xietain left the collector's pocket world to put a few things in order since this time he would be absent for several days. First, he looked for Xietain and Callie. He intended to take both girls with him. Callie was easy to find, she was alone in the villa of the base that belonged to Xietain. "What are you doing?" Xietain asked, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. Callie turned her face to look in his direction and said coldly, "I thought the blind person here was me, but I guess I was wrong." After a brief pause, Xietain shook his head and said amidst a sigh, "Callie, you really don't want to try to make friends?" Callie smoothly controlled her wheelchair away from the mutant plants she had been smelling and approached Xietain until she stopped about a meter from him. She raised her head and he lowered his in such a way that if Callie could open her eyes, they would definitely be staring at each other. "Friends? Luo Ning is pretty good, but she's too obsessed with getting stronger and practically won't talk about anything other than zombies and mutant beasts. Wen Yan is so shy, she barely speaks, while Wen Yun is a naughty little pervert. As for Xietain, she goes on and on about how amazing her dear father is, or how beautiful her two adorable mothers are. Understandable for a newborn." Callie kept talking without pausing, her voice was flat like that of an emotionless robot. "Then there are the adults, a little better than young children, but worse in their own way. Bullet, there are 2 reasons why I left Eventide World and decided to follow you even if it meant getting away from Seraphina, the only person I could trust." She finally paused briefly before calmly asking, "You know one of the reasons, but do you know the other?" The first reason was obviously the fact that Xietain did not treat Callie as a treasure merely because she was able to draw and comprehend runes of a practically divine level. In fact, she knew that he valued more what she always considered a disability. As for the second reason, he didn't know. But it definitely wasn't the fact that he had promised to treat her. After 5 seconds of silence, Callie said in a cold voice, "It's because you are an anomaly." "Thank you for the praise?" Xietain smiled bitterly and shook his head. "You are an anomaly in the same way that I am one." Callie kept her face fixed on his as she said indifferently, "Anomalies like us would hardly feel at ease with others, am I not right? You should know better than anyone by now. That Shangguan Bingshui woman is probably the greatest genius of your entire faction, perhaps next to that other woman named Feng something, but none of them are even close to you. Do you dare to tell me that deep in your heart you don't feel lonely? Do you dare to tell me that you don't feel a little out of place around them?" At first it was not like that, but as time went by the distance between Xietain and those close to him did not stop widening. He hadn't noticed it this much while he was stuck at level 50, but once the barrier between the First Order and Second Order was broken through, that difference became simply too big to ignore. Even Shangguan Bingshui had realized that she was no longer of any help to him in the battlefield. "You and I are anomalies, so it's only natural for us to be together." Callie snorted and turned her chair around to have her back to him. She moved closer to the window and said in a detached voice, "Doctors group with doctors, not mechanics, just the same way geniuses don't play with normals. That is the reality of the universe in which we happen to live." Xietain had thought that his method of keeping Callie away from abnormal things would be good for her to be able to have the most normal life possible, but he overlooked one very important thing that he only now realized. After a moment of silence, he calmly asked, "Callie, what do you really want?" "I don't know what I want," Callie paused before saying with confidence in her voice, "but I definitely know what I don't want." She turned to look at him and said in a firm voice, "I don't want to sit around all day in this wheelchair or on a couch waiting for time to pass while I talk or listen to others discuss nonsense that doesn't concern me at all." "I see." Xietain nodded, and then added, "We'll think of something." After sending Callie to the collector's pocket world, Xietain looked for Xietain. The girl was helping in repairing the east wall that had suffered severe damage during the war against the mutant beast army days ago, when the earth evolved without warning. "Eh? Are we going to our family's private world?" "Yay." Xietan's eyes shone brightly, and she began to hop with joy when she heard that her beloved father was taking her to the collector's pocket world. Finishing with Xietain, Xietain looked for Xiao Xiao, but when he invited her to join them, the pink-haired girl refused with some bitterness. "Big brother, this time Xiao Xiao will not go with you." Xietain noticed that it was difficult for Xiao Xiao to make such a decision, so after a moment of silence he faintly asked, "Is something wrong?" "No. My watermaker skill is of much use, isn't it?" Therefore, I thought that to avoid a lot of future problems for you I could help build a large defensive moat around all the bases where other mutant beasts can be put, and it will take me a long time to have it done. So. Xiao, you. Xietain looked at her in awe and thankfulness. Hee. I just want to do my best for you. Xiao smiled brightly, and seeing this Xietain finally couldn't contain himself and hugged her tightly. Thank you a lot, little pink dolphin. Just make sure to hug me a lot in the future, okay? I promise. Promise. Xietain also contacted Shangguan Bingshui, and after explaining the situation she said it would probably take a day or two to reach Inner Mongolia. Not everyone had a third-order mutant beast capable of running through the sky with agility, comparable to a fourth-order mutant beast. Xietain, I'll have Little Snow pick you up. Shangguan Bingshui, okay, I'll finish preparing some things here in the meantime. Xietain, okay. Make sure you keep your mana at maximum, please. Shangguan Bingshui, yes, wait. Come to think of it, doesn't this conversation seem a little weird? Xietain, weird? What's weird about it? Shangguan Bingshui, well. You said you would send Little Snow to pick me up as if she were your private limo, and then you asked me to keep my mana to the max as if you were asking me to wear your favorite dress. Xietain, now that you mention it. Shangguan Bingshui, just to let you know, I won't go to your house to watch movies. Even though I never did it, I know you won't want to watch movies. Xietain, Bingshui, you are being naughty right now. Shangguan Bingshui, I'm being naughty, and what can you do about it? Xietain, I will spank your butt if you continue, I mean it. Shangguan Bingshui, you wouldn't dare, especially with that little succubus of yours around. Xietain, I've already touched you all over anyway, a spanking would be no big deal at this point. Shangguan Bingshui has left the chat. Xietain, this is the weirdest conversation I've ever had in my life. After hanging up the call with Shangguan Bingshui, Xietain chuckled and returned to the collector's pocket world. Oh? Did something good happen? Lilith immediately questioned as she saw the amused glint in his eyes. About that. Xietain explained what had just happened, and seeing Lilith nod, he wasn't particularly surprised when he heard her next words. Oh, that time while playing Darkroom you sure had fun, Lilith folded her arms and said with both eyebrows raised, so, how is it? I knew you were definitely fooling around. Don't change the point. Lilith snorted and continued to press for answers, answer honestly. Which set of breasts is better? Little sister Xietan's boobs? Maybe that brat's? Or are mine's after all? Yours, of course. Xietain replied without batting an eyelash. Lilith snorted and with a triumphant smile walked off to play with Shirlin. As he watched her back and seductive waist swaying like a water snake with every step she took, Xietain felt that this relationship was quite peculiar. A girlfriend who didn't get jealous or angry when her boyfriend touched other women's breasts and even got happy to be selected as the best. Xietain muttered under his breath, quite strange. Quite mysterious. For a second, and I felt like a protagonist of some light novel. Just at that moment, Fire Sorrow approached and said in a serious voice, Xietain, there's something important I remembered regarding the Divine Daydream pomegranate. Xietain hadn't known Fire Sorrow for very long, but he had seen all sorts of expressions on her face, sadness, joy, disappointment, hope, disbelief, shock, and even a bit of jealousy and love. However, this was definitely the first time he had seen her so serious that even her smile had disappeared. He nodded and became serious too as he somehow sensed that things would not be so easy. Although they wouldn't be to begin with, just that they would probably be even more challenging than Xietain estimated. The Divine Daydream pomegranate is a rank 3 consumable fruit as soon as it is born, and as it consumes high-temperature flames its rank will continue growing non-stop until rank 6. A treasure like this is bound to attract the attention of other beings, so there's a probability that there's a guardian you'll have to fight against to get it. Fire Sorrow sighed and said in an apologetic tone, back then I fought against a higher existence of 5th order to get this Divine Daydream pomegranate I showed you before, but it was so long ago that I had completely forgotten about it. 5th order higher existence? Xietain opened his eyes wide and said in disbelief, how am I supposed to face something like that? I'm still at level 100 for crying out loud. I don't think you need to worry about that. Fire Sorrow ruffled his hair a bit and said in the voice of an older sister talking to her little brother, "You'll probably have to fight a fire spirit. Fire spirits range from the 2nd order to the 4th order, and if it's you it should be okay, shouldn't it?" Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 1035 A Guardian Who Cannot Be Defeated, Part 2. Xietain finished drawing the sketch for the style of armor he wanted, and when Lilith saw him nodding to himself she couldn't help but throw a bit of reality on his dream world. "Xietain, you are aware that there is a 99.99% probability that this fancy new armor of yours that you are trying to forge will be completely destroyed, aren't you? My beloved little succubus, could you let me be happy for a moment? Sympathy is appreciated. He. And so it was that Xietain realized that even if his armor didn't end up in pieces in his battle against the guardian who would likely be protecting the fruit he needed, it was most likely that the poor armor would end up melted by the heat of the sun or in an extremely miserable state to even consider reusing it as a trash can. Be that as it may, this daddy is going to do his best as life dictates. Xietain nodded and immediately set to work. The first thing he did was to pull out a total of 125 pieces of metal the size of an adult fist from his storage ring. After spending several hours adjusting the temperature of the endless blue lotus flame and helping the little flame remember that feeling, Xietain immediately picked up the first piece of metal with a pair of tongs and carried it to the working furnace. "Lilith, if I'm not mistaken, that metal you're using has heat-resistant properties, doesn't it?" Xietain, "Yep." "Lilith, are those the ones you brought from Eventide World? 8% fire resistance?" Xietain, "Yep." "Lilith, that means you'll have to go through an 8% more powerful hell in order to get that piece of metal to the point where it can be malleable, doesn't it?" Xietain, "Yup." "Lilith, cool." Xietain, "Looks like someone's looking for a good spanking, doesn't it?" "Lilith, what are you talking about?" Xietain, "Humph. You just wait until we can finally be alone and you'll see what's good. Now that I've evolved to the 2nd order, I'm sure a movable heart will help me endure your charm a lot more even if we can't reach the last base." Lilith, greater than over equal to less than over equal to. While Xietain and Lilith were spending time alone having all sorts of unserious and mostly playful conversations to pass time with each other, Fire Sorrow, who had learned a bit more about the collector's pocket world, was standing next to Xietain. "Xietain, so, Big Sister Fire, my father for some reason really likes it when Mom Lilith calls him Daddy occasionally, but when Xietain tried to do it before he told me I better not." Fire Sorrow, "I think you should listen to your father." Like a small child listening to legendary stories from an adult, Fire Sorrow sat under the shade of a tree and listened to Xietain for hours. As to what was the story? Of course, it was the story of the great Xietain. All the exploits of the new king of China were magnificently boosted by his lovely daughter, and Fire Sorrow, who wanted nothing more than to learn about the life he had lived so far, couldn't wait to hear more. However, every story had to end sometime no matter how long it was. After more than 6 hours, little Xietain finally ran out of more to say, so this time it was Fire Sorrow's turn to take the lead. "Little Xietain, would you like me to teach you a bit of magic?" "Oh. Big Sister Fire, Lilith Mom has already taught Xietain a bit of magic. Now Xietain is better than before at controlling her mana and using Ice Maker." "Well, even if that's the case, I'm better than your mom Lilith using magic, since I have more experience than her." Fire Sorrow smiled kindly. "Besides, I can teach you some magic to boost your physical capacity, how about it?" "Oh." Xietain really loves to punch with her fists. Xietain immediately began to jump and clap her hands without taking her eyes off the demonic army higher existence in front of her. Fire Sorrow had learned that in the collector's pocket world the laws of the soul record were way more lax compared to the outside world. But after giving it some thought, she realized that it made sense since only those who had no ill intentions towards Xietain could enter this place. Moreover, after learning that Xietain was actually a being born from the records of Xietain together with Xietain Bing Shui and a mysterious talent with the skill clairvoyance, she couldn't help but take interest in her. Fire Sorrow really wanted to see how far this little future Ant Queen could go. And just like that, time simply passed. It took Xietain longer than he would have liked to get the first piece of metal to the point where he could shape it with his forging hammer. But they said the first steps were the hardest, so he pressed on. After molding the first piece into a plate, he handed said metal plate to Callie, who had been waiting bored, and then immediately set to work on the second. Or so he was about to do before Lilith reminded him that he had to bring Shangguan Bingshui to the collector's pocket world, and realizing that he had been preparing everything longer than he thought went out. Sure enough, Shangguan Bingshui was already waiting for him in the living room of the villa by the time he got there. "Ready?" he asked. Shangguan Bingshui looked at him cautiously and nodded without turning her back on him at any time. "Relax, I won't spank you." Bai Zemin waved his hand, and just as Shangguan Bingshui sighed, he added with a smile, "For now." The first 3 plates were the hardest to shape, the rest became easier as Bai Zemin found the trick where to hit to make them move at his will. "Lilith, I really don't understand how you could possibly shorten the time between the first plate and the fourth by more than 4 hours. Finding the trick? It doesn't make sense." Bai Zemin, little succubus, it's all about finding the sweet spot. Lilith. For some reason I feel like you're being a pervert now. Bai Zemin. Lilith, what's with that face? You're not even trying to hide it anymore, are you? Bai Zemin, I don't know what you're talking about. As the speed at which Bai Zemin finished each plate accelerated exponentially, the number of metal plates on Callie's table gradually piled up. Callie was not distracted by the amount of work she had to do and simply focused her whole heart and mind on the plate in front of her. In fact, she was so focused that there came a point where she didn't even notice when Lilith arrived with more metal plates. A week later, Bai Zemin finished with the last plate. "I think that's it for the metal plates," he said as he looked at the sketch he had drawn earlier. "So? What will you do now?" Lilith looked at him curious as she had no idea about blacksmithing, so she didn't know what his next step would be. "I'll use some scales from that." Bai Zemin rubbed his chin as he nodded in a certain direction. There, no more than 200 meters away, a giant lifeless body lay silently on the flattened grass. "That sea monster?" Lilith was astonished and asked in perplexity, "Zemin, didn't you strip that creature of its records?" "I did." Bai Zemin walked over to the dead Leviathan and gently tapped one of the scales as he calmly said, "But I did not strip the hardness from the scales." "You." Lilith looked at him with wide eyes before forcing a smile. "Scoundrel, you were planning to use this beast as forging material, weren't you?" "Ever since I saw the picture taken by our satellite." Bai Zemin snorted self-satisfied. If the great Fourth Order Leviathan, an ancient beast that had been a sign of terror and respect not only for its strength, but also for its colossal size, were to hear what Bai Zemin had just said, the creature would probably spit out 1,500 liters of blood and die of a heart attack triggered by anger. Be that as it may, Bai Zemin was a man who did not like to beat around the bush, so after setting his eyes on a target he immediately worked on it to reach it. Exactly 3 days later, Bai Zemin had finished removing the scales he would be using this time. He had heated them in the forging furnace using the power of the endless blue lotus flame. He had further flattened them into solid lines. And he had also used a total of 50 second-order soul stones to turn each scale into a piece of armor with over 2,000 defense points each. Lilith. Don't tell me you're going to do what I have in mind. Bai Zemin. Lilith looked at his expression and was speechless. Exactly 6 weeks later, Callie had finished drawing runes on each plate Bai Zemin had given her. "Alright, time to put this all together now." He nodded and immediately set to work. In front of him were over 130 plates, of which 5 were scales, and the other 125 were metal. Some of them were similar in shape and others were completely different. There were flat ones, there were curved ones, there were others with strange shapes, etc. Each plate would make up a part of the complete armor, and since Bai Zemin had worked on the basis of a sketch he had made beforehand, it was not difficult for him to know which plate was what and where to put it. Using a leather armor coated by a thick layer of magic and mana for the inside, Bai Zemin began to put each plate on top of the leather, and a day later the job was finished. A unique armor created from 3 armors. Fire Sorrow looked at the work in front of her and couldn't help but praise leather, metal, and scales of a fourth-order beast. Truly superb. It's not finished yet. Bai Zemin looked distantly and noticed how the freezing air swirled in the distance, forming thick layers of frost everywhere. There's still the last ingredient missing. The full body armor was already a rank 3 equipment. Bai Zemin hoped that with Shangguan Bingshui adding his not-so-small grain of sand it would evolve to rank 4. A few hours later, Shangguan Bingshui, together with Bai Shilin, approached the group. Bai Zemin took the initiative to walk towards them, and upon seeing the adult woman's pale face, he couldn't help but ask worriedly, "Are you okay?" tired. Shangguan Bingshui nodded with dull eyes. She extended her hand outward, revealing a beautiful platinum-colored snowflake with extremely complicated runes all over it. Here it is. Over 180.000 points of my mana boosted with every single inch of my magic power. Xietain could feel his skin freeze even without touching it, but it was after touching the 5-centimeter diameter snowflake that he finally realized how much power it had enclosed inside. Probably 1/10th of Beijing would be buried under ice if this thing exploded, and considering that Beijing was more than 10 times its former size, one could only try to imagine how terrifying the power of the small snowflake was. Xietain returned to his workbench, and under the watchful eyes of everyone placed the small snowflake on the chest area of the armor. After that, he took out a third-order soul stone and said with some regret, too bad. He really wanted to use a fourth-order soul stone for this armor, but given the circumstances it was not possible. Soon, he started working on the magic blacksmithing. A fire-resistant armor. An armor that would allow him to withstand high temperatures. A piece of armor that would not overheat. Lilith and the others watched Xietan's increasingly sweaty face, but none of them interrupted him. As he frowned and closed his eyes tightly, they all stared at him silently, without daring to make the slightest sound. Exactly 10 hours later, the survivors of the main base located in the Chongqing district of China's capital watched wide-eyed as the Sky Destroyer broke through the clouds and flew away until it finally disappeared into the distant sky. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 1036, A Guardian Who Cannot Be Defeated, Part 3. This is Sky Destroyer. Requesting permission to take off. This is Control. The entire area has been completely cleared. Sky Destroyer, you have the green light for takeoff. All green for takeoff. All functions check out. External teleport magic circles deactivated. Disengaging all support equipment. Cornerstone power commencing. Main engine on. All engines are on. Output gate open. External pressure level has increased. Turbines have been activated. Lin Xiaoyan, leader of the Sky Destroyer's control and maintenance team, turned to face the throne-like seat in the center of the spacious room and said in a respectful voice, "Leader, we can take off at any moment." Xietain opened his eyes and said calmly, "Take off." Take off. Taking off. Everyone felt a slight tremor as the over 8 turbines roared and the body of the huge warship that had been silent for months shook for several seconds, while with the front end pointed towards the clouds. There were a total of 12 seats on either side of the commander's throne, 6 on each side placed parallel to the throne. In them, 12 geniuses with classes focused on ship control, weapons, and technology that surpassed that of Earth by several years, who had been studying the Sky Destroyer after being carefully selected by Xietain made everything easier for him. While it was true that Xietain had the ability to control the entirety of the Sky Destroyer by himself, a warship was meant to be controlled in different sectors by different people to bring its potential to the maximum possible. It was much more efficient to have one operator in charge of a task and focusing 100% of their mind on that task than to have Xietain alone having to split his head between dozens of cannons, maintain the engines, control the shell temperature, raise or lower the magic barriers depending on the moment, monitor the remaining energy, etc. Standing on either side of Xietain, Wen Yan watched in amazement as the front wall suddenly seemed to transform into a huge screen displaying in clear detail everything happening in front and outside the ship. Wen Yan watched everything with wide eyes. As for Wen Yan, she put one hand on her waist and the other on Xietan's left shoulder as she noisily said, "Ha! Who knew we would visit outer space someday, right, Yan?" The two twin sisters had also been trained to know the functioning of the Sky Destroyer, and thanks to their tutoring, they were two great extensions to Lin Xiaoyan's team, except that they were not steady members. Standing on top of the south wall of the base, Wu Keqian, Sun Ling, Evangeline, Wu Yijuan, Shangguan Xingyue, and many other people of great power watched silently as the large warship broke beyond the clouds and became a small blue glowing spot. Seconds later, the Sky Destroyer was no longer visible at all. Flying into outer space, Sun Ling muttered with her eyes still fixed on the sky. Many things I thought I would never have the chance to see, or do now, don't seem so impossible anymore. That's because Xietain brought us this far. Wu Yijuan responded to her mother's words. She used her big, bright black eyes to look toward the place where the Sky Destroyer had disappeared as she said softly, "It was him, the one who changed the fate of many people." Shangwan Xinyu chuckled, and as she looked up at the sky she said in a playful voice, a college boy from an ordinary family like most people in the world who aspired to an ordinary job has taken over China in just over a year. And the previous president of China, who had everything his whole life, is now held prisoner in a dungeon more than 70 meters underground. Life really is very interesting. Hearing Shangwan Xinyu's words, everyone fell silent as if by prior agreement, and when they thought about their past lives, some of them were surprised. I thought I would always live under the shadow of father and the Wu family. But now I have not only surpassed my father's status, but also led my family to survive in this new era. Wu Keqian smiled with complicated emotions as he recalled the past. A simple decision can change so many things. If at that time we had decided to stubbornly oppose and fought against that little boy. Sun Ling smiled bitterly and shook her head. Really, a simple choice can lead us to hell or heaven, depending on which door we choose to open. Oh, none of you nor the Wu family would have fallen to such a precarious level. Shangwan Xinyu winked at Wu Yijuan as she said with a suggestive smile, you two gave birth to a beautiful, talented, and very intelligent daughter who either because of her crush or her ability to judge chose correctly where to stand at the right time. Wu Yijuan's uncle sighed and many complicated emotions shone in his eyes. His son, Sun Jia, had been Bai Zemin's best friend in the past. However, Sun Jia simply played with the trust Bai Zemin had in him, and he did it in the worst possible way. Bai Zemin was nobody in the past, and Sun Jia had everything. They were both people from different worlds. Now, Sun Jia was just a level 20 soul evolver without any real combat ability, and if it wasn't for the fact that medicine had advanced tremendously and magic now existed, Sun Jia wouldn't even be on his feet after the blow Bai Zemin gave him that day a year ago. Thinking of the endless opportunities and possibilities that simply disappeared because of a simple bad choice, Sun Jun couldn't help but stare at the reddish-haired man on the screen of the tablet he was holding. Tian Wu, that girl. She'll probably have to live with regrets for the rest of her life. All because of a bad joke that wasn't funny at all. Feng Hong's somewhat muffled voice came from the tablet. He was in Shanghai taking care of the base under construction around the seaside area, but when he heard that a big operation would be taking place to search for a natural treasure capable of solving his daughter's situation, he naturally wanted to take part as far as he was allowed, even if it was just watching the ship take off. I just hope that she can continue her life, and maybe someday be really happy. Feng Hong sighed before cutting off the communication. Despite having said those words, Feng Hong knew her daughter's personality very well. Past Feng Tianwu was arrogant in a disdainful way, and when she was in high school, she looked at all people from normal families as inferior creatures who could only work for pittances of wages for the rest of their lives. However, Feng Tianwu matured a lot as time went by, and despite still being arrogant, that disdain of hers towards people disappeared and turned into indifference towards everyone in general. She knew she was competent, and therefore lost interest in others. The problem was that now a person who was much more capable than her had appeared, a man, the same man she had laughed at years ago and had caused him considerable trauma. Feng Hong was not an idiot, he was a grown man of age, with a lot of life experience. He knew in his heart that even if his daughter did not feel love for Bai Zemin, she was certainly interested, and for her sake, Feng Hong hoped that this interest of her would soon disappear and not escalate into something else. Because although his interaction with Bai Zemin had not been particularly much, Feng Hong was clear about one thing. Bai Zemin was the proudest and most arrogant man he had ever met in his entire life. Even if he hid it, the aura exuded from his bones made even people who were in high positions for a long time feel that they were inferior. Such a person certainly knew how to keep grudges, even if he forgave. Full cover magic barrier. Turn off. Lin Xiaoyan slowly stood up tremblingly as he looked up at the large screen to his right. The image of vast outer space was reflected in his watery eyes as he stammered, "We have successfully left Earth's atmosphere. All controls are working perfectly." The 45-year-old man who had been rejected by the CNSA had finally fulfilled his dream of outer space travel. He turned and looked at Bai Zemin with eyes overflowing in gratitude. "Leader, we are in outer space." Bai Zemin stood up abruptly, and with great excitement waved his right hand outward. In response to his gesture, the back wall turned into a large screen just like the front one, except that instead of showing the vast outer space, what it showed was the image of the beautiful and bright light blue planet. At the same time, on the hottest star in the solar system, a beautiful pair of fiery red eyes glowed for an instant before fading out again. As Xietain watched the scene in front of him in a daze, what he did not know was that the guardian of his target for this great operation had already noticed him, and this in itself showed that the difference in strength was more than big. At the very least, it was big enough for the battle to be lost even before it began. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 1037. Worried and frightened by Xietain. The beautiful clear bright blue radiance of the planet Earth was far more beautiful in person than it was through pictures or images. As the Sky Destroyer slowly but surely drifted away from Earth in the direction of the sun, those aboard the warship could not help but stare in wonder at the giant screen on the back wall through which the clear image of their world, their home, was displayed. So beautiful. Meng-Chi whispered softly as she gazed with amazed eyes at the oceans and lands of her place. Bai Dilan hugged his daughter and wife as he slowly said, "I never thought that a member of our family could have such a wonderful view of our world live and direct. Now not only is he a member of our family, but the four of us can see him, together. Even our little Xietain can appreciate this view from the other room, besides Bing Shui." Xietain smiled gratefully as she looked back at the little not-so-little young man who not so long ago was running disobediently all over the place with his face covered in dirt. Her son really had grown up. It was just that like any mother in the world, her children would always be kids. The fact that Xietain was now the highest authority in China with the power to decide on the life and death of millions did not change anything for Xietain. The fact that Xietain was a soul evolver who had surpassed any movie superhero capable of wrecking entire countries and continents with a few attacks had not changed things for Xietain either. Strangely enough, however, what made her realize that her little man had grown into a great and wonderful man was seeing him standing in front of the throne-like seat. Xietain was slightly dazed as he watched his home becoming a little more distant every second. Despite all his accomplishments to date, for some reason, he felt extremely proud and a sense of accomplishment washed over him as he realized he was doing something very few humans had ever achieved in their lives. For someone like him who came from an ordinary family of salaried parents who worked hard to make ends meet, the view of his homeworld from outer space was something he could only dream of but never touch, and yet here he was, leading a team of geniuses and powerhouses on an extremely advanced warship. "You have become a great man, my handsome child." Xietain snapped out of his daze at the sound of his mother's voice, and when he turned his face slightly to look at her he was slightly surprised to see the soft gaze she was looking at him with. Xietain smiled with pride and at the same time with some nostalgia as she slowly said, "Tall, strong, handsome, talented. Who would have thought that crybaby brat would one day grow up like this?" Crying brat. Xietain couldn't help but roll his eyes before chuckling and shaking his head. "Mother, I'm sure many young girls who ignored him in the past would definitely tear their hair out in frustration if they saw your son right now." Lilith in her lily form giggled softly from the side. Xietain laughed in amusement as she nodded, "I'm absolutely sure of it, girl." Xietain shook his head and let everyone marvel at the beautiful sight. His expression turned serious as he ordered Lin Xiaoyan, "Head straight towards the target, get as close as possible, and when the Sky Destroyer's shell starts to overheat activate the full magic barrier." "Roger." Lin Xiaoyan nodded, returning to his serious appearance from before. After a brief pause, he hesitantly said, "Leader, if I may." "Go ahead." Xietain nodded. Lin Xiaoyan took a deep breath and while looking at the small column where the soul stones that powered the ship was, he said in a deep voice, "We now have a fully powered fourth-order soul stone feeding the Sky Destroyer. We can even fire the main cannon if necessary. But the number of third-order soul stones is still too low." Xietain looked at the column that had been named Cornerstone and in fact, what he saw was something he already knew. "We don't even have 60% of all the spaces covered and more than half of third-order soul stones are half empty at this point." Lin Xiaoyan frowned slightly and continued, "Most of the Sky Destroyer's power is powered by the fourth-order soul stone you brought. I'm afraid if we're not careful with the energy we expend we might waste the fourth-order soul stone too much, and if that happens—" Lin Xiaoyan did not continue, but Xietain knew what he meant. The main engine's power was precisely the fourth-order soul stone that was supposed to focus solely on powering the ship to move and fire the main cannon. However, there were many functions of the Sky Destroyer that were being used through the power of the fourth-order soul stone, so it would naturally wear out much faster in the absence of third-order soul stones. "It's fine, we'll only be here for less than 2 hours if everything goes well. As long as we don't fire the main cannon we should have enough energy for a whole day. There's no need to worry." Xietain gave him a few pats on his shoulder. Lin Xiaoyan took a deep breath and nodded, feeling a little more relaxed. Bai Zemin exchanged glances with Lilith before looking at his family, the Wen twins, and Xiaya. I'll go check on Bing Shui to see how she's doing and if she needs help with anything. You all just relax and enjoy yourselves for now. Soon, Bai Zemin walked out of the control room with Lilith following close behind him, and once the door closed behind, Fire Sorrow appeared on his other side. This ship can kill even maximum level 4th order soul evolvers. Where did you get it from? Fire Sorrow asked, trying to keep her awe under control. The Sky Destroyer itself was not something that would normally surprise her. The real problem was that its technology was too advanced compared to the technology that Earth's humanity had developed in this era. Bai Zemin knew that the Sky Destroyer's cameras couldn't catch Fire Sorrow if she didn't want to be caught, so he wasn't too worried, but just as he was about to answer her question, Lilith beat him to it. Fire Sorrow, haven't you used scanning magic all over Earth? Lilith looked at her with weird eyes before adding, perplexed, don't tell me you haven't really visited the rest of the world at all. Not at all. Fire Sorrow replied with a faint warm smile, I've only been by Bai Zemin's side as long as I could and didn't wander away. Why do you ask the obvious? Forget it. Lilith looked forward, and she could feel the corner of her mouth trembling slightly as she muttered to herself. Bai Zemin gave Lilith a sidelong glance before focusing again on the corridor before him. The Sky Destroyer was in an ancient ruin left behind by an ancient king. Brother Kong was the previous owner of the Sky Destroyer. As for who created it or how old it is, I'm afraid I can't answer, since not even I know. Ancient king? Brother Kong? Fire Sorrow looked at him in confusion. Long story. Bai Zemin stopped in front of a firmly closed alloy door, but even then he could feel the temperature rising in the surroundings. In short, Brother Kong was the previous king of China, just that the kingdom had another name back then. We fought and became sworn brothers before his soul faded away. Oh. Fire Sorrow nodded, a little understanding and a little not understanding. Bai Zemin took a deep breath and subconsciously stroked the chest area of his new armor. The color of the armor was dark blue with streaks of silver color. In the center, what appeared to be a blood-red gem occasionally glowed ominously. The commander's ring glowed faintly, and at the same time as the alloy door opened to either side, Bai Zemin's body was enveloped by the beautiful deep blue blaze of the endless blue lotus flame. Just as the doors opened, a great surge of heat that threatened to melt the ship assaulted Bai Zemin, but he stepped forward at the same time as a large amount of frost shot out from his armor. Swoosh! The heat cooled, creating a large amount of steam that was soon nullified after crashing into the once again closed doors. In the room, Bai Zemin immediately focused his eyes on the woman with her eyes closed inside what appeared to be a large icebox before looking at Shangguan Bing Shui. Bing Shui, can you go on? He asked worriedly as he saw her sweaty face. For another 3 hours at most. Shangguan Bing Shui replied weakly. 3 hours later, I will have consumed all the mana I was saving for this, so if you don't want the Sky Destroyer to be destroyed by this woman, think of something before the time runs out. From Inner Mongolia to the Chongping district base, where the Sky Destroyer was located, there was a distance that it took Bai Zemin 10 hours to cover, as he was not in too much of a hurry. During those 10 hours, Shangguan Bing Shui was in the Collector's Pocket World accumulating mana inside an epic-grade treasure called Mana Stone, which allowed her to store up to 70.000 mana points for the user to use in times of crisis. She was using that mana to fuel the power of her Ice Maker skill and not let Feng Tianwu's flames kill everyone present. Father. Bai Shilin walked towards Bai Zemin and hugged him demurely. My dear Shilin, is something wrong? Bai Zemin noticed that his ever-cheerful daughter seemed somewhat subdued for some reason. She wasn't even appreciating the view and wasn't even paying attention to Shangguan Bing Shui or Feng Tianwu. Bai Shilin raised her head and looked at him with her big black eyes filled with worry. Shilin doesn't like it here. Can we go back home? Bai Zemin was a little surprised, but soon nodded, of course. Shilin wants to wait in our family's world in the meantime? However, Bai Shilin shook her head and then hugged him tightly again, as if she didn't want to detach herself from his body. Bai Zemin looked at Shangguan Bing Shui with puzzled eyes. She's been like this ever since we started approaching the sun. Shangguan Bing Shui shook her head to indicate that she had no idea what was happening. Lilith looked at Bai Shilin and after a moment of silence nodded. Maybe it's the third order fire spirit that's protecting that fruit? Third order fire spirit? Zemon's ears immediately perked up upon hearing this. Oh, there's a third-order fire spirit there. Lilith nodded calmly. It hasn't stopped releasing its aura all this time. Probably because it's built up too much temperature after being in the sun for who knows how long. Third order. Zemon sighed in relief. If it's just third order, then there won't be a problem. Forget third order, Zemon was confident that he could fight practically anything below the fifth order. However, as he looked at Shirlin and felt her body trembling more and more as she hugged him tightly, Zemon couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. But strange as it seemed, Zemon could not sense any danger or anything particularly unusual. Still, Zemon's instinct told him that it was right to pay attention to Shirlin. She had the records of the strongest weaver ant after all, and weaver ants were known for their ability to detect danger apart from their monstrous physical strength. Approximately 40 minutes later, several alarms lit up throughout the ship, but only for a brief second as they immediately shut off automatically. Zemon was about to ask what was going on when Lin Xiaoyan's voice came from the walls. Leader, we are just above the highest point reached by the drawing force of our sun. We have activated the total magic defensive barrier to protect the Sky Destroyer's hull. What should we do next? Zemon looked at Shangguan Bingshui, and after a brief moment of looking at each other in silence she said softly, "Be careful please." "I will." He smiled slightly and nodded. Zemon squatted down and gently kissed his daughter's forehead while caressing her face tenderly. "My little baby, you wait here obediently, okay? Father will be back very soon and then we will return home even faster." Shirlin looked at him with extreme worry, and if it wasn't for Zemon holding her in the place she would have already pounced on him. "Father, do you really have to go? Shirlin doesn't like it here. Can we go now, pretty please?" Zemon continued to smile kindly, but hearing the tremor in Shirlin's voice he couldn't help but frown slightly as the wariness in his heart grew more than just a little. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 1038, Hidden Guardian. In the control room of the Sky Destroyer, Yi Linger trembled in fear as Zemon's image was reflected on the giant holographic screen before them. Not only Yi Linger was trembling in fear, but Bai Delan and Meng Qi were also as worried and frightened as she was as the image of their son/brother was etched in their eyes. By now, Zemon had left the protection of the Sky Destroyer. He had even stepped out of the warship's full defensive magic barrier. His body was enveloped by a layer of deep blue flames that contrasted greatly with the light yellow flames of the sun. On his back were two ash-gray wings, from which large amounts of silver frost shot out sideways only to be devoured by the heat in less than an instant. Xiaya glanced sideways at Zemon's family before turning her attention back to the screen. After a moment of silence, she remarked, "His Majesty will be fine, no need to worry." Meng Qi looked at Xiaya and said lightly, "You seem to have practically blind faith in my big brother, Xiaya. Has he not proven himself to be worthy of such faith to us?" Xiaya replied indifferently. Her black eyes glittered slightly as she said confidently, "His Majesty's path has only begun, there is a long way to go and many steps to climb." Xiaya's personality was not particularly pleasing to most, but there was one thing that was certain, her understanding of Zemon was not low at all. However, the fact that Xiaya knew Zemon so well was completely natural, considering that she had linked to his records hundreds of times. Besides, he is the only soul evolver who can endure wolf pack without dying. Xiaya added in her heart. She was proud, incredibly proud. But that pride was not there without foundation. Xiaya knew that she had the qualifications to be proud. In fact, if she were to give her 100% at present she believed that not even Shangguan Bingshui or Shangguan Xinyue would be able to defeat her. Ah! Wen Yan's cry of fear and surprise brought Xiaya back to the real world, and when she focused on the giant screen she was startled for a moment when she saw a huge flare of flames big enough to devour an entire human base rose from the sun towards Zemon. The destructive power was so great that even Xiaya turned slightly pale at the same time as her face lightened with every inch that the flare approached. Just at that moment, the image of Zemon extending his right hand outward was shown on the giant screen. From the palm of his hand, a great whirlwind of blue flames roared out and met the solar flare head-on. Rumble. The Sky Destroyer's full defensive barrier rumbled slightly, but everyone's attention was on the two groups of flames, one blue and one golden, fiercely ramming into each other with the intention of devouring the other. After a few seconds of stalemate, the blue flames seemed to become stronger as if receiving some kind of delicious food, and with renewed strength suddenly began to swallow the golden flames until in less than 5 seconds they had managed to completely swallow the solar flare. In the Sky Destroyer, when Yen subconsciously patted her chest a couple of times upon seeing this, thank heavens. Bai Dilan supported his wife whose legs had become weak, and Xiaoya's voice rang out again inside the room where only gasps of astonishment and sighs of relief could be heard. You see? His Majesty will be fine. Yilinger looked at Xiaoya with a slightly pale face and nodded weakly, why yes. You're right. She looked at the image of her son and murmured softly, my child will be fine. He has to. If anything happened to Bai Zemin, Yilinger would never forgive either Feng Tianwu or her family. That girl had already hurt him enough in the past once, she should stop being a problem for her son once and for all. Too much consumption. Bai Zemin frowned as he gently retracted his outstretched hand. The power of the endless blue lotus flame was undoubtedly high, but it was no longer the divine flame that was said to be able to endlessly spread out to reach the ends of the universe and incinerate everything. The solar flare that had assaulted him earlier burned at over 300.000 degrees Celsius. To suppress it, Bai Zemin had to use the power of the endless blue lotus flame and 250 mana points to strengthen it using his over 7,200 magic points. He had already activated Blood Immortal Radiance to deny the negative effects of the cosmic radiation that overwhelmed outer space, and therefore his time was running out. With an expression of determination, Bai Zemin flapped the pair of ash-colored wings behind his back and plunged deep into the sea of flames until he finally disappeared completely from the Sky Destroyer's vision, and soon also left the area that the ship could study in the midst of such monstrously high temperatures. Bai Zemin was fine for the first 2,000 meters, but as he submerged beyond the sun's destructive atmosphere and its magnetic field his expression became uglier and uglier for every meter he descended. He was forced to constantly expend mana to fuel the power of the endless blue lotus flame. 3,000 meters. 3,400 meters. 3,700 meters. 3,900 meters. 10.000 meters. 15.000 meters. After descending 15 kilometers from the Sky Destroyer's location, Bai Zemin could barely see a single fiery red gas amidst the orange flames that burned so fiercely that even the endless blue lotus flame was no longer enough to suppress them. Even with the 7,257 magic points that Bai Zemin had in total, boosting over 100 mana points per second was not enough, and if he was not using the power that his armor had thanks to Shangguan Bingshui and Kali, he would definitely have been turned to ashes in less than a blink of an eye. Blood Surge Breastplate of Ice Magic. Full Body Heavy Armor. Rank, 4. Physical Defense, 28.000. Magical Defense, 24.700. Durability, 109.990/110.110. Special Options. 1. Increases fire resistance by 15% when the user is fighting alone. 2. When the user fights against enemies that are more than 100 levels above, increases movement speed by 50%. 3. Reduces the damage caused by resulting shockwaves by 30%. 4. When consuming durability, can increase the user's attack power by an amount corresponding to the durability consumed. Special attached skills. 1. It can store and release large amounts of ice-type magic. The user can spend mana to use ice-type magic as long as the armor has enough frost energy inside. 2. When you kill an enemy that is one order above you, the special skill Blood Surge is activated, which allows the user to receive a 1,500 point boost in a random stat for 30 seconds. The effect can only be accumulated 2 times. Description: hard to believe, but this armor capable of surviving the Armageddon of a world was born thanks to the masterful teamwork of 3 humans who less than 2 years before the birth of the armor were just ordinary living creatures. A work of art capable of granting its wearer the ability to survive in the most hostile environments that exist. The armor that had been born after 2 months of continuous effort and hard work was truly outstanding. Extremely high overall defense, excellent durability, high-quality options, work accomplished by Bai Zemin's blacksmithing. Already high-quality options boosted by over 100%, a skill capable of increasing the user's power tremendously, a free space to store a second skill, and a tremendous overall improvement in the overall armor, work accomplished by Kali's practically divine runes. Finally, the ability to increase fire resistance from 12% to 15% thanks to the colossal amount of stored frost energy, as well as the ability to grant the armor wearer the power to use ice-type magic relatively freely, work accomplished by Shangguan Bingshui. If not for the fact that Bai Zemin had an armor that was worthy of a fourth-order king belonging to a world that had been evolving and growing for at least 10,000 years, he would have already died without even feeling pain. Bai Zemin spent over 25 minutes flying around the area that Fire Sorrow had marked, but he still wasn't able to find the fruit he was looking for to save Feng Tianwu. Although Fire Sorrow had pointed out the approximate area where she had picked her divine daydream pomegranate in the past, it had been a long time since this had happened, so even for her it was not possible to remember the exact location of the consumable fruit. Furthermore, along with the growth of the Earth, the entire solar system had expanded, as otherwise the blue planet would eventually end up colliding with the rest of planets. This meant that the sun had also grown, and considering that in the past it took 1,000,000 Earths to cover the volume of the sun, one could only try to imagine how huge the enormous fireball was in the present day. After 30 minutes and having traveled thousands of kilometers using overlap regeneration to boost his agility beyond 13,000 points practically without rest, Bai Zemin finally began to feel anxious. Blood Immortal Radiance had a duration of only 60 minutes, and if in that time he couldn't find the fruit for Feng Tianwu, then he would be forced to retreat and return to Earth. All or nothing. Bai Zemin gritted his teeth and endured the ever-increasing heat he felt. Although his body was enveloped by the flames of the endless blue lotus flame and his armor kept sending blasts of frost in and out to keep him safe, Bai Zemin's skin was turning redder and redder. The durability of the armor had already dropped below 70,000 points. Exactly 7 minutes later, Bai Zemin's expression suddenly brightened as he suddenly sensed great hot energy gathered no more than 20 kilometers away from his current location, and without hesitation, he controlled his wings to fly there. Not much later, seconds at most, Bai Zemin's heart was filled with joy and his eyes sparkled as the image of a small peach-like fruit hung from what appeared to be a flame tree. There it is. Bai Zemin sped up like an excited child, but just at that moment, the silhouette of what appeared to be a flaming creature appeared blocking his route. The fire spirit was indeed a third-order creature, probably around level 180 or 190 at this point. The creature seemed to turn into a frenzy at the sight of Bai Zemin approaching as it let out a shriek that caused the surrounding sea of flames and gas to shake, and as if the sun had life it attacked the invader with everything it had. Frozen world. From the silver streaks of Bai Zemin's armor, over 60,000 mana points were blasted out all at once, and all the flames that assaulted him were suddenly enclosed by a thick and beautiful layer of light-colored ice. Although the giant ice prison immediately cracked and would probably be shattered in the next second, an instant was all Bai Zemin needed to close the distance between him and the fire spirit. He was moving with over 13,000 agility points, plus the first option of his armor after all. The ice spirit was definitely very surprised when the enemy in front of it blocked its attack, so when Bai Zemin stopped for a moment in front of it the creature couldn't even respond. Scram! Bai Zemin did not hold back at all and directly converted 90% of his 7,030 natural agility points into strength. Annihilation of the falling sky turned into a dragon claw-like gauntlet, and at the same time as the golden halo of overlap regeneration circled Bai Zemin's body giving him the appearance of a god, he gritted his teeth and slammed over 14,000 force points directly into the head of the surprised fire spirit. Boom! Rumble. The punch carried so much power behind it that for a single instant all the surrounding flames seemed to disappear after exploding outward, as if they could not withstand the pressure of Bai Zemin's fist. However, that brief instant was enough, and it was all he was looking for. The fire spirit's body exploded into millions of tiny sparks after being struck by an attack of such magnitude, and its special characteristic of being able to regenerate from within the flames was not activated as all the surrounding fire had been expelled outward. You have received the soul power of Third Order, Feng Spirit, level 187. You cannot absorb any more soul power. Bai Zemin sighed in relief and thanked Lilith for the tutelage on fire spirits, before rushing forward with the intention of picking the fruit now clear before his eyes. However, just as his hand touched the divine daydream pomegranate, Bai Zemin's body froze as he felt the most bone-chilling aura he had ever felt in his entire life approaching at lightning speed. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 1039 Phoenix Cry and Identity Revealed. Bai Zemin had not ignored the completely abnormal feeling of fear and trepidation that Bai Shilin had been sensing. He had also not forgotten or overlooked Shangguan Bingshue's words when she had told him that Bai Shilin had been behaving a little strangely ever since the Sky Destroyer had started heading towards the sun. Bai Zemin had been ready to face a great enemy. He had even assumed that the fire spirit he would face would likely have a great purity of soul power, which would allow the creature to fight against enemies of a much higher level and thus perhaps take on the current Bai Zemin to some extent. However, Bai Zemin let his guard down for a split second right after receiving the soul power of the fire spirit. The joy and relief of easily defeating an enemy he thought would be difficult to face inadvertently caused Bai Zemin to lower his guard for a brief moment, and when he sensed the aura of the enemy hidden over him it was too late to even try to hide. But Bai Zemin was a decisive and even cruel person not only to his enemies but also to himself. "I'm taking this whether you like it or not." He gritted his teeth and with a pull snatched the fruit from the flaming branch. Without even bothering to check the records of the consumable fruit, Bai Zemin flapped his wings as he activated overlap regeneration. Boom! Using 7,000 magic points to convert them into 7,000 new agility points, Bai Zemin's body turned into a golden blur with ash-colored flashes around the edges and in an instant, his figure disappeared. With over 14,000 agility points he only needed a few seconds to reach the Sky Destroyer, and with the ship's main cannon plus his own personal strength, Bai Zemin was confident he could defeat this enemy. As for defeating it alone, "I can't win. I can't win." The same words seemed to be eating him in the head, repeating over and over again as he pushed his body to the limit. Bai Zemin ignored the damage that the flames were causing him now that he was focusing primarily on movement speed. His only goal was the most primordial of all, a goal that all living beings, intelligent or not, carried engraved deep in their records. To survive. Definitely. Just as Bai Zemin thought of this, his skill, predicted danger sense triggered. His face distorted into a horrifying expression as an overwhelming flood of pain he had rarely felt struck his soul. Red blood with tiny golden flecks began to gush from his eyes as the image from 1 second ahead of the danger on the way was transmitted to his brain. Bai Zemin fought back the pain as he let out a war cry and as quickly as possible moved to the left without even thinking about it. The sudden movement at such a high speed naturally wasn't taken well by Bai Zemin's body, but he didn't have time to worry about it. Swoosh! Just 0.01 seconds after Bai Zemin moved, a blazing flare of crimson fire shot out beyond him from the deepest part of the sun. His right wing was directly consumed by the flames, but fortunately, it was made of Bai Zemin's shadow, so when he left the area of effect of the crimson flare the wing grew back. Bai Zemin let out a cry of pain as the expression on his face became even more fierce and horrifying than before. He couldn't see his right arm or his back, nor did he want to know how they were. He simply tried to ignore the pain but it was impossible. And had it not been for that thought screaming louder in his heart, he probably would have given up right there. Survive. Survive. Survive no matter what. Just at that moment, Bai Zemin's pupils contracted fiercely as he caught a flash of purple lightning raining down from the sky. That's... He finally understood where the terrifying pressure and feeling of oppression he was feeling was coming from, and remembering the words Lilith had said to him long ago, he finally knew what kind of enemy he was facing. Control room of the battleship, Sky Destroyer. It had been over 40 minutes since Bai Zemin had submerged into the sun, and except for occasional low murmurs, the only sound that could be heard was that of the operators when they needed to perform some kind of action on the ship. "Lady Xia, you are one of Zemin's loyal followers, aren't you?" Yilinger asked as with wandering eyes, she looked around the giant screen all over trying to find her son. "Yes. I am." Xia nodded. "In that case." Yilinger gulped and with a pale face asked trying to keep her composure, "Do you have any idea how my son is?" "He is alive if that is what you wish to know, Mrs. Yi." Xia answered calmly. "My soul and that of His Majesty's other loyal followers are slightly in contact as we are all connected to his. As long as this contact exists, it will mean that His Majesty is alive." Yilinger nodded with her face still slightly pale and whispered softly, "That's good, that's good." Bai Dilan whispered something in Yilinger's ear, and although no one heard what he said it was clear that the man was doing his best to appease his wife's nerves and fears. However, even Bai Dilan himself was feeling fear and apprehension. All awe and sense of pride about visiting outer space had vanished the instant his son submerged unprotected into the golden flames of the blazing sun. But Bai Dulan had a family to look after, and as a man he could not allow himself to show such fear in front of his wife and daughter. Meng-Chi was so nervous and fearful that she dared not look up at the giant screen. Her black eyes were wandering around inside the control room when she suddenly noted that her brother's girlfriend was behaving a little oddly. "Lily, are you okay?" Meng-Chi didn't particularly like Lily in the same way she didn't particularly like Shangguan Bingshui. However, this did not mean that she hated them or anything. Therefore, seeing the always smiling, elegant, and calm Lily suddenly frowning and biting her right thumbnail made Meng-Chi wonder if there was something wrong with her. Lilith raised her head softly to look at Meng-Chi and nodded, "I am F-." Abruptly, Lilith's body froze and her face turned so pale that it ended up scaring Meng-Chi. Just as Meng-Chi was about to ask what was wrong, Fire Sorrow's figure revealed itself against her will and immediately attracted the attention of those inside the room. "Who are you? How did a person get in here? The Sky Destroyer system failed?" The 12 operators immediately went crazy and all kinds of cries of surprise and disbelief filled the control room. Fire Sorrow's face was even paler than Lilith's and her whole body shook hard as her eyes stared at the holographic display on the front wall of the room. A sound similar to that of a metal plate being torn apart caused the weaker ones to shriek and cover their ears. At the same time, a bright purple light covered the surroundings as a giant neon-bright lightning flash fell from somewhere and struck the ship directly. The thought that it was the end of everything welled up in everyone's hearts, but after 2 seconds the purple lightning disappeared and when everyone looked at each other, they noticed that amidst the terror they felt there was also relief. A needle could be heard falling on the floor, that's how soundless the room was. That just now was. Fire Sorrow's voice trembled, but she couldn't finish her words. "Soul punishment!" Lilith exclaimed in alarm. She had felt her records being scanned by something when the purple light covered the ship, and even though she suffered no damage she knew that if that purple light had really wanted to hurt her there was nothing she could have done against it. "Soul punishment?" Meng-Chi muttered as she looked at her with narrowed eyes. "Lily, do you know what that was?" Yi Linger asked with lingering fear. However, it was then that Lilith understood what was going on. "Don't tell me." "Zemin." Her entire body trembled and the blood on her face seemed to be drained in an instant as she realized that if she and Fire Sorrow were fine then the purple lightning was aiming at another higher existence. As if to prove Lilith right, a split second after she screamed out in fright the name of the love of her life, what sounded like the scream of pain from a non-human beast boomed from outside and shook the Sky Destroyer's magical barrier slightly. That was. Lin Xiaoyan swallowed with wide eyes before muttering in shock, "Phoenix?" Although Lin Xiaoyan and the rest had never heard the cry of a phoenix before, that shriek from just now was definitely how the legend described the cry of the mythological beast capable of fighting as an equal against dragons. It was then that something that left everyone suffering a shock 1,000 times bigger happened. As if by prior agreement or as if something was forcing them to do it, the eyes of everyone moved towards Lily, but what they saw was no longer that human woman with a normal face, but a seductive body. Her clothes had changed, and she was now wearing a beautiful black silk dress that clung to her skin softly. Her hair had become as black as ink and now fell to the lower part of her back. The color of her eyes had changed into a beautiful ruby that glittered like precious gems. Her whole being had transformed and the aura she exuded made it impossible for anyone present to react when Lilith slashed forward with her hand. A black crack appeared in the middle of the control room, and with an expression of fear but full of murderous intent Lilith immediately stepped into the crack, being immediately followed by the unknown purple-haired woman. A few seconds passed since the crack had closed before a voice brimming with shock and disbelief sounded in the form of a whisper inside the deathly silent room. That was Lily. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 1040, The Rage of a Woman Who Suffered for Millions of Years. Seconds before Fire Sorrow's existence as well as Lilith's identity were revealed. When Bai Zemin saw the neon purple lightning raining down from the sky, 2 words immediately flashed in his head. Higher existence. Whatever was attacking him was definitely a higher existence. Why the hell is there a higher existence in this place? Why the hell is this goddamn thing attacking me? Bai Zemin's mind went into chaos as his body was struck by the purple lightning. But he disregarded any damage he might receive and with the sole aim of getting away from whatever was chasing him pushed his speed to the point where his entire body began to tremble in pain. Isn't that thing afraid of the punishment of the soul record? Xietain didn't understand what was going on and the restlessness of his records pushing him to survive wasn't particularly helping in this situation. Just at that moment, a cry that shook Xietan's soul rang out miles below him. Scree! The cry of the phoenix was not announcing its arrival or its ascent, quite the contrary. The cry of the phoenix was announcing its descent. Xietain couldn't help but look back over his shoulder, and what he saw was an image he would definitely not forget anytime soon. The creature that was attacking him was a large bird, probably over 100 meters tall. Its wingspan measured at least 300 meters, and its entire body seemed to be made of golden fire. The flames that enveloped the bird-like creature were so bright that even the flames of the sun looked dull in comparison. However, in front of Xietan's eyes, the phoenix's flames quickly began to lose their radiance, and like a chicken being plucked, they detached from its body at speeds visible to the naked eye. But, when Xietan's black eyes met the crimson eyes of the phoenix, he did not need the other party to make a sound to understand that it would not give up until it killed him even if it cost its life. As if to prove to Xietain that he was not wrong, the phoenix opened its mouth wide and its eyes glowed brightly. Predicted danger sense triggered, and Xietain could do nothing against the howl that fled from its mouth as an overwhelming rush of pain that threatened to incinerate his brain assaulted him. The bleeding in his eyes worsened and his vision began to blur, but Xietain once again held skyward, this time angry at the world as a whole. You want to kill me? It's not that easy. He immediately used soul manipulation and in less than a second chose the 3 skills he wanted to evolve without even thinking about it. You have activated soul manipulation. For the next 5 hours, the 3 skills you've chosen will be 1 order above normal. 3rd order gravity manipulation, 4th order gravity manipulation. 3rd order golden bones, 4th order diamond body. 6th order magic break, 7th order anti-magic domain. Xietain ignored the soul record messages and did not stop his speed. He still tried to move away from the phoenix, but this time he didn't just try to dodge and run away. He reached his left hand back and turned the pain he felt into fury as he bellowed at the top of his lungs, white hole. Only half a second had passed since the small white sphere appeared before a great flare of crimson fire struck it. Rumble. A large amount of the phoenix's magical attack was devoured by the white hole, but there was still more than half that managed to withstand the suction force of the gravitational phenomenon. Double domain. Xietain didn't dare to not give it his all and immediately activated his 2 domains. First, the domain of the Wolf Emperor shined, and when the 2 golden eyes shone in the stars, the power of the phoenix immediately weakened by 20%. This meant that the higher existence attacking Xietain had a weaker killing intent overall. Then, a large sphere of nothingness surrounded Xietan's body, just an instant before the phoenix flare struck him. Unfortunately, the goddess of luck did not seem to be on his side this time. Watching as the golden flames still continued their ascent about to devour him, Xietan's pupils contracted fiercely. The 50% chance of nullifying any magical attack launched by an enemy 3 orders above him had not been triggered. A flash of madness flashed in his eyes as the feeling of death assaulted him, and without hesitation, he turned around in the middle of his ascent as he punched out with annihilation of the falling sky covering his hand. Boom! The fist that contained all the physical attack power Xietain could summon hit the weakest point of the flare, weakened by the white hole, and weakened again by half after entering the surrounding anti-magic sphere. Although Xietan's punch effectively weakened the attack even more, allowing him to survive. There was no way for him to come out of something like that unscathed. His body flew upwards at the same time as his blood flew everywhere, getting evaporated by the flames of the sun in less than a second. Xietain forced himself to fight against the pain, and taking advantage of the momentum he flapped upwards with all his might. He wasn't quite sure since he wasn't paying attention, but just as he was trying to stabilize his body, Xietain thought he saw his whole body. The situation was so bad that he didn't know if he had lost any limbs in the previous impact. Go to hell. Xietain pointed down, and the white hole immediately released all the fire-like magical energy it had contained. The phoenix, shocked by everything it was witnessing and experiencing pain hundreds of times more terrifying than Xietan's as its records were being devoured, had no time to move to the side. Under its wide-open crimson eyes, its own attack turned against it and slammed it in the back. Boom! The beast shrieked in pain and for the first time in these short seconds spoke. Impossible. It was a woman's voice. Xietain didn't care that he was facing a female phoenix. Female or male, none of that mattered. What mattered was that this phoenix was his enemy. Domain? 2 domains? Gravitational ability? Who the hell are you? The phoenix flapped her wings with new vigor and launched herself upward. The speed of the phoenix was at least 4 times faster than Xietan's, so even though he was trying to move away, the reality was cruel. However, he also noticed that the phoenix was weakening very fast. Although Xietain did not know what level this lower existence was at, he could feel her movement speed and power plummeting. Unfortunately, even though the phoenix was weakening greatly with every passing second, it would probably take a minute to descend to a lower existence and another minute for the law of time that had stopped since the time she ascended to a higher existence to strike her and turn her body into mortal remains. 2 minutes? Xietain wasn't even confident of surviving 30 more seconds. Just as he saw the Sky Destroyer, Xietain suddenly stopped and his expression froze. Right. Even if he returned to the Sky Destroyer, would it make any difference? Xietain did not believe that the main cannon had the power to kill a higher existence. Besides. Roar. Xietain looked over his shoulder and his figure was illuminated as from the mouth of the phoenix a great whirlwind of golden fire roared in his direction as if it had a life of its own. If he dodged this, what would happen to the Sky Destroyer? No. For starters, even if he took this attack, would it be enough to keep the ship from being destroyed? The phoenix probably knew that she would die anyway. Killing one lower existence and killing several no longer made any difference to her destiny. Why the hell was this damn phoenix attacking him, to begin with? Xietain could not understand how a higher existence could be so stupid. His predicted danger-sensed skill was triggering harder and harder, but Xietain could no longer feel pain. He was so overwhelmed by everything he was going through that he had even forgotten that not far away from him were 2 allied higher existences. Just before Xietan's eyes completely darkened as an adverse effect of the skill, predicted danger sensed overwhelming his brain and hurting his sense of sight, he saw a golden-colored barrier even brighter than phoenix flames appeared between him and the whirlwind of fire. Boom! Xietain heard a muffled and suppressed explosion, and immediately afterward 2 extremely anxious voices sounded on either side of him. Are you okay? For a brief moment, Xietan's brain went blank and it wasn't until then that he finally remembered about Lilith and Fire Sorrow. That's how focused he had been on surviving. I'm fine. He muttered in a weak voice as he nodded. Lilith quickly took to watching his body with extreme attention as she carefully supported him as if she feared that the ash-colored wings on his back would stop moving and he would fall into the terrifying ball of gas known as sun. This is... Lilith was astonished and her mood greatly improved upon discovering that Xietan's condition was not nearly as bad as she expected it to be. However, there was someone who was more focused on revenge than Lilith. Rumble. Fire Sorrow's murderous intent was probably the greatest murderous intent Xietain had ever felt in his entire life. Even he who had killed billions of lives felt small, similar to a baby in front of a large building. Xietain felt so overwhelmed that he was literally forced to deactivate the domain of the Wolf Emperor. As for the anti-magic domain, Fire Sorrow was a higher existence of the 7th order, she was not affected at all. You too. The phoenix's voice contained something else besides surprise and anger, there was fear there as well. As if finally awakening from that consuming state of rage, the female phoenix exclaimed in shock, Demonic army? Why is the second in command of the demonic army in this place? Lilith might not be very well known among all the higher existences that existed, but Fire Sorrow was a different story. How dare a little 5th order phoenix? Fire Sorrow's body trembled as she whispered to herself. How dare you? She had suffered millions of years, millions. Millions of years of sorrow that devoured her heart until it turned Fire Sorrow into an empty shell inside. Only she knew for certain how much she had suffered, endured, and how many times she longed for a small glimmer of light in her life. In the last few days, months if one counted the time spent inside the collector's pocket world, Fire Sorrow had smiled more times than she could remember in the last few thousand years. Genuine smiles, smiles that came from her now not so empty heart, thanks to the small glimmer of hope that had recently entered her life. And yet, a little phoenix that wasn't even 20,000 years old wanted to take away that hope she had found after millions of years of searching? A little fifth-order phoenix, below level 550? Fire Sorrow's level was the absolute peak of the seventh order. If she, one of the most powerful beings in the cosmos, could not protect someone, then she might as well not exist and disgrace herself. Fire Sorrow didn't care about motives, nor did she ask for reasons. She extended her flawless hand outward and with eyes as cold as ice clenched her fist fiercely, spatial distortion. The female phoenix had no time to cry out in pain. Hundreds of black cracks appeared around her body and exploded, causing the phoenix's body to split into hundreds of pieces to then be sucked into the spatial hole that had formed. Just before the hole closed completely, Lilith watched with a pale face as void lightning struck the phoenix's dismembered body into nothingness, without leaving even ashes behind.